In our series on food and nutrition security, funded by Zach Nelson and Elizabeth Horn. This session will be filmed, so if you have, or recorded, so if you have a cell phone, if you could turn it off, that would be great. Today we're wonderfully happy to have Carrie Fowler here as our speaker. Carrie is a colleague and long-term friend and a really interesting man, so I think this will be a great session. Work with Carrie goes back from the time he was on the board of CIMMYT, the International Wheat and Maize Research Center in Mexico, and our early days of having Bellagio conferences on genetics and climate change. If you've never been to Bellagio, you should definitely try to arrange a meeting there. It's a great place to have a meeting. Great ideas come out of that meeting. But Carrie's known for many things, not the least of which are his role in the CGIAR centers. He was a professor at Norway's Agricultural University. He was one of the prime negotiators of FAO's Global Plan of Action on plant genetic resources. You can tell from his bio here, which is lengthy, that he's won numerous awards. Most recently has been the William Brown Award at the Missouri Botanical Garden, but also recently the Heinz Award. So that list goes on. But there's a lot of interesting parts to Carrie as well. He and his wife, Amy Goldman, have a place in Rhinebeck, New York, and are really known in that region for their heirloom varieties of tomatoes and peppers and melons and I guess livestock more recently. And so great place to go visit him because he actually does what he talks about. He's also a movie star. The Seeds of Time is one of the Sundance Film Festival's award-winning films, and much of what's in that film, some of which will be talked about today. It's a great film. Also profile in The New Yorker. He's a very charismatic person who has done so much that he's gotten picked up in a variety of different ways. That New Yorker profile is excellent. I know him best, and I think of Carrie as the former director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. Carrie was the one who spearheaded this Doomsday vault here for the backup of all seed collections throughout the world. And it's really his leadership, I think, that has put crop biodiversity, the protection of crop biodiversity, especially in the face of climate change, really on the map. And so who would have known this mild-mannered guy with a Tennessee accent would be such a powerful force in the international agricultural circles. But we're very pleased to have you here. I'm happy to have him here on campus because usually when he comes, he escapes with Wally Falcon and goes off to the wine country, and I never even see him or get to talk to him. So we're happy to have him talk to us today on Doomsday Vaults, Genebanks, and plant breeding in an age of climate change. Carrie?
Well, thank you, Roz. I wish you had done something to reduce expectations. It would make it easier to meet them. Today I want to step outside my own comfort zone a little bit, and my lecture will be sort of in three parts, followed at the very end by a tour of this place that I'll give you with slides. The three parts are these. I want to talk for a few minutes about the general nature of climate change and crop adaptation to climate change, and then go into how it is that agriculture and crops became established in the United States, how they became adapted to the different environments in the United States. And then thirdly, I want to look at what the state of crop diversity is in the world today, both the conservation and the utilization of it, and try to look a little bit forward, and this is the risky part, about how we're going to use that crop diversity in an era in which the climate and environment are changing so quickly. So to do all these things, and well, I should say that each of those individual sections is, I think, perhaps not the important part of my talk today. It's whether or not, if my talk is important at all, it's whether or not I can connect the dots between them. So I've got a fairly big task ahead, and I'm going to jump in and be in a little bit of a hurry, and I hope you'll forgive me for that from the audience. This past March, was the 361st consecutive month in which the global average temperature for that month exceeded the 20th century average for that month. 361 consecutive months. Now that's either a lot of coincidence or, you know, as Mae West, the famous movie siren of the 1930s said, one figure sometimes adds up to a whole lot. And in this case, 361 add up to a lot. The rate of increase in our temperature now exceeds anything that we've seen in the last 120,000 years. We have new horticultural zones. Let me see if I can work this. You know, every 10 years, the USDA updates our planting zones. Gardeners go by these. It's based on the temperatures for the previous 30 years. And the green colors show how the zones are creeping northward. This is the change in the last 10 years. Of course, we now have more than 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, so something is happening out there. And yes, there is such a thing as natural fluctuation in climate, but also there is something that's quite real about the physics of CO2. The slide that I often use, and it comes from here and from our friends at the University of Washington, is this slide. And I've found that audiences relate to this rather better than almost anything I can show them about climate change. This is a histogram where the blue bars show the historical distribution of average growing season temperatures in South Africa on the left and Peru on the right. And the red bars are the projections for the future. And what you'll see, of course, is that there's very little overlap, which means that the hottest temperatures of the past would be some of the coolest of the future. And since we know the hottest temperatures of the past have been quite problematic, we can guess, and if that's going to be the best we get in the future, that this could be quite problematic. The majority of African countries by mid-century will be experiencing novel new climates over at least half of their growing area. And the worst impact is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where because that's where we find the largest concentration of the poor. So what does excessive heat actually do to plants? Well, of course, it alters the life cycle and growth period of plants. The leaves curl and wither. This reduces light interception. It reduces photosynthesis. Respiration increases. The plants lose moisture. It affects the quantity, the quality, the extent of growth in plant tissues. At a certain temperature, pollen can be sterilized. Heat causes and exacerbates existing moisture deficiencies. It affects all parts of the plants, and at a certain point it reduces yield, and it can even reduce the nutritional quality in cereals and forages. So what is it that plants are going to have to adapt to? Well, clearly they're going to have to adapt to higher average temperatures, but they're also going to have to adapt to higher extremes, higher minimum temperatures, in other words, higher nighttime temperatures, longer periods of very hot weather, and hot weather during inconvenient times for the plant, such as flowering. There's going to be a lot of fluctuation. And they're going to also need to adapt to new assemblages of species, new assemblages of pests, diseases, soil microorganisms, etc. So in summary, our crops are going to be facing new combinations of conditions for which there are no analogs, no historic experience. And I think that means that our crops are going to require new combinations of traits in order to deal with new combinations of conditions, as well as, of course, the magnitude and the speed of the change. At an increase of 2 degrees Celsius, our crops are really going to be in a historically unprecedented situation. And in this context, There's this wonderful, I find it quite interesting, quotation from a professor, Townsend Peterson at the University of Kansas, who said that in this context, there are likely to be, and he said, idiosyncratic responses to climate change. Indeed. But climate is not the only thing that our agricultural systems and crops are facing. We will also have challenges in regards to available land, water, nutrients. Fertilizer use is up 23-fold since I was born. And phosphorus, there are many projections about phosphorus peaking in terms of production by somewhere between mid and the end of the century. And then of course, climate. There's two messages or conclusions that I draw from all of this. First is that I think we're going to have increased uncertainty, surprises, and heightened risk in agricultural production systems. And this is going to manifest itself in market disruptions and export bans and civil strife, all the things that we've seen already when there have been bad harvest. And as well as increased vulnerability among the people who can least afford increased vulnerability, in other words, the food insecure. None of us know precisely when, where, or with which crops these impacts will be felt, or even if they're going to be primarily climate or water or nutrient driven or a combination of all of these. But I think that the incidence of real trouble and dislocation will increase in severity. That's the first message. The second message, I think, is, and this is critically important, we simply cannot expect crops to come pre-adapted to conditions that have never before been experienced in the history of agriculture. Adaptation to novel conditions is necessarily going to be tenuous, contingent, fragile. And this is really going to diminish, I think, the word security and the phrase food security. And yet, in this context, we're being told, and here, sort of fill in the blanks, that we need to produce 50, 60, 70% more food by mid-century. Now, Lloyd Evans, who is a crop physiologist in Australia, put together this list of 6 different ways in which we can increase global food supplies. And as you glance down that list, you can see that, frankly, we're moving in the opposite direction in a couple of those cases. And in a couple of those, it's somewhat unlikely that we're going to make very big progress or very quickly. So I sort of focus particularly on number 2, and the issue of how and whether crops are going to be adapted to climate change. We realize, and ideally, what we not only want is for crops to adapt to climate change, but to increase production along the way, which is quite a tall order. So that begs the question of what it is we know about crop adaptation or adaptation in general. And what we know is actually what we learned from this guy back in 1859. Darwin put together something that now looks quite obvious. He said if you have variability, diversity, and you have inheritance, hard inheritance, and there's natural selection, that over time there's evolution, or in a sense, adaptation. Well, we do have diversity. We have a great deal of it in agriculture. Inheritance works the way it always worked. And natural selection for our agricultural crops is in our hands. It's being done by plant breeders and by farmers. So this then raises the question of, well, what do we know about diversity, about the experience that we have with crops, and their adaptation? here I'll delve into a little bit of family business. As Roz mentioned, my wife is actually quite a gardener and has written a number of books on gardening. She tends to focus on particular crops at a time and writes books about them. So here are a few pictures of squashes that she grew and had photographed. And much of what we know about diversity is sort of this type of picture of it. There's a visual diversity amongst agricultural crops. Of course, this hides the underlying diversity, which is adaptation to particular environments and climates, and also resistance to pest and disease and nutritional qualities and cooking qualities and taste and these kinds of things. But you get an idea from this how much diversity there is in squashes. This is a wonderful photograph. This is actually our back porch. And I took this with my iPhone, not a particularly great photo, but I just walked around the corner one day and I found this because my wife Amy had been out harvesting the Jonathan squashes that day. It seemed like a family portrait in some way. She's also written a book about melons, and again you see this diversity of melons, and is now working on a book on peppers. There are a lot of uses of peppers, including decorating the door with them. If you look back, however, at our history as a country, very few crops that are major crops in the United States are native to the United States. Jerusalem artichokes, cranberries, a few other nuts and berries. This is not a lot. And by the way, none of the crops that I've just shown on the screen here are native to the United States. What our young country lacked was an extensive infrastructure or an established agricultural base. What it needed in the early days was it needed crops, different crops, and it needed those crops to be appropriate for different environments and climates in the United States. And it wasn't always evident, by the way, in the beginning days, what crops or what kind of crops from abroad would grow well in the United States. By the way, if you look at latitude, you'll find that Jamestown is in the same latitude as Seville, Spain. And you'll find that Boston, Massachusetts is actually south of Florence, Italy. So believe it or not, in early days, people thought, well, this is great. We can grow citrus and olive groves in Massachusetts. And they tried that, and they were kind of confused as to why that didn't work in the beginning. They didn't immediately cotton on to the fact that, well, it's a lot colder in Boston than it is in Florence. So what this young country of ours did was it began to import massive quantities of agricultural biodiversity. It instructed the U.S. Navy, when the ships would return to the United States, to bring back seeds. It instructed the U.S. consular offices to send seeds. We bought an enormous amount of commercial seed from little seed companies in Europe and from farmers in Europe. We're talking about the 1700s and 1800s now. We sent out plant collecting expeditions, and some of them were mission-oriented collection expeditions where we were trying to get particular disease resistance or something for a particular crop. We had in the 1800s, we made 24 agreements with other countries regarding reciprocal exchanges of plant material for food and agriculture. So we were importing a lot under legal agreements from other countries. We published notes on collecting and conserving and transporting and cultivating all of this diversity. We published inventories of the diversity that were coming in. We reduced tariffs on importation of seed. We reduced postage rates on mailing of seeds inside the United States. And we got plant material from very exotic places. We got tomatoes from Fiji and muskmelon from Tonga. We got wheat and cabbage and rice from China. All of this stuff coming in, and the numbers were astonishing. One particular program of the U.S. government, we imported 600 different varieties of apples, 700 different kinds of pears, 353 kinds of mangoes, believe it or not, 700 avocados. That's a lot of different diversity. I'm not talking about trees, I'm talking about different varieties. And when we talk about varieties, it's not the same as the variety that we use today if we get a seed package and plant it for our garden. Here is what in the old days, and even now, in the gene bank world that I live in, constitutes a variety. Now, if you look at this slide, it looks like there are, 7 different varieties of wheat. But this was a sample collected from a single farmer's field. So it's not really a variety as we think of it and being sort of distinct, uniform, and stable. It's more of a population, a collection. So even the numbers and extent of the importation of diversity into the United States in those days sort of mask how much diversity was really coming in. What was the purpose of assembling all this diversity? Well, there was a conscious purpose, and that conscious purpose was experimentation. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson famously said that the greatest service that can be performed for a country is to contribute a new plant to its culture. But he also said that in order to establish agriculture in the United States, it was going to require a tremendous number of what he called an abundance of unsuccessful experiments. So what the United States did was it took all this diversity and it got it out to small farmers. And it did that largely through mailings, through the postal system. So this table gives you a sense of how many packages were sent out in the different decades in the 1800s. At the top point, we were sending out 20 million packages in 1897. Each package contained multiple packets of seed. And the seed, very consciously from the U.S. point of view, had experimental quantities of seed in it. It wasn't enough to plant a full field with a particular crop, but enough to plant a row or two and to test it out and to see what would happen. The government was contacting postmasters around the country and saying to the postmasters, who in your area is going to be a good person to experiment with this diversity and to develop it? And so the seed went to those kind of people in particular. Agricultural societies were beginning to be formed. It went to those. And the government itself put together groups of horticulturalists, nurserymen, professors in universities, skilled amateurs, to consciously test out the diversity that it was sending out. And then, of course, in addition, in the late 1800s, the government established agricultural experiment stations. My great-grandfather, for whom my oldest son is named, was responsible for establishing the first one in Tennessee. And we even had 200 acres of the Washington Mall that was devoted to agricultural experiments and the testing of this diversity in the 1800s. In the agricultural press of the time, and the numbers there are remarkable in terms of the per capita readership of the agricultural press, you can find many, many articles instructing farmers how to select their materials for crop improvement. Really quite remarkable what was happening. So in a sense, what I think was happening was perhaps one of the largest, if not the largest, agricultural experiments in history. At least what I'm quite convinced of is that the diversity that was being distributed and the experimentation with it is responsible for the establishment, the success, the spread of American agriculture. There can be no other, as far as I know, explanation for how we came to have our crops growing in so many different environments. Why we could have wheat growing essentially in all 50 states and in remarkably different environments. And the other remarkable thing about this is that much of this work took place prior to 1900. In other words, prior to the rediscovery of Mendel's laws of heredity. After the rediscovery of Mendel's laws of heredity, by the way, after 1900, in the first couple of decades of the 1900s, there was a lot of skepticism about Mendel. People thought, well, he figured out inheritance with peas, but that doesn't mean it works for tomatoes or wheat. So for a couple of decades, people were a little bit unsure. So the rise of scientific plant breeding was fairly slow, but it happened. And of course, with plant breeding came the need for more structured collections that you could access regularly, structured collections of crop diversity that you could access and use for plant breeding. But with plant breeding came the rise, of course, of modern varieties, and they had traits that farmers liked. They were high yielding, maybe they were resistant to diseases, and farmers began to grow them, obviously quite logically, and by growing them, they no longer had the necessity of conserving, of saving their own seed from year to year. They had a choice of whether or not to save their seed from year to year. And many of them didn't, because they were replacing their crop varieties with a new variety. And that in turn resulted in genetic erosion, the loss of diversity. We were losing this incredible richness of diversity simply because farmers were no longer growing it. They were opting to grow the new varieties, and they might use their previous variety, one that traced its history back to the Neolithic, to eat in a bowl of porridge. And that diversity was therefore lost. Fast forwarding to the 1970s, there was an organization called the International Board for Plant Genetic Resources. It was created and first to try to collect and conserve some of this diversity. And in the first 10 years of this organization, Rome-based, they organized 300 collecting expeditions and 450 gene banks were built. So all of a sudden, there was a lot of attention paid to conserving diversity and maintaining it. About 20 years after that, the Food and Agriculture Organization recruited me to come to Rome to lead the first global assessment of the state of the world's plant genetic resources. And when I got there and assembled this team, I started to see that there were some, very good collections of crop diversity. Here's a picture of the National Gene Bank of the United States. It's in Fort Collins, Colorado. So there were some good international collections, and there were a few good country collections. But for the most part, if you looked at the situation in developing countries, the situation was not nearly so good. Many of those seed banks were poorly housed, even more poorly housed. And I didn't find a single seed bank or gene bank in the world that had a secure multi-year budget. In fact, our own seed bank in Fort Collins doesn't have a secure multi-year budget. It got cut 8% last year. A number of the seed banks had poor management too, poor equipment. And of course, even in the best of circumstances, seeds will eventually die, even in the best storage conditions. But typically, many of the species will live for a long time if stored properly. So peas, for example, can survive a couple of thousand years, and some of the grains a couple of thousand years. So when we started to survey countries about how often they needed to regenerate, in other words, refresh their seed supplies because the germination rate was falling, think of the arithmetic. If a seed was only going to last, or a seed sample was only going to last for 100 years, you would, on average, regenerate 1% a year. But we were getting figures such as 50 to 100% need for regenerating after only 15 years or 20 years of the existence of the seed bank. In other words, something drastically wrong was going with the conservation. In addition, there was very little link between the conserving of this diversity and the use of the diversity. So here's a slide that shows in the Philippines the number of samples that are of crops used and or genera of crops for which there's a breeding program as opposed to the ones that are being stored for both the Philippines on the left and Mali on the right. The Mali collection is very small, so a lot of that collection is of crops that are actually bred there. But you can see for the Philippines that the orange bar is quite small, and that's the genera for which there is a breeding program, and the purple bar, the genera for which there is no breeding program, which raises the question of what's happening here. Why are they conserving this domesticated biodiversity if they're not going to use it? There's another way of looking at it, and this is the collection of Zambia. And this shows you what percentage of the global collection of these crops is stored in Zambia. And the message I get from this slide is that the Zambian collection of all these crops is very small. So is this a viable size for a collection to do plant breeding when you have such a narrow sliver of the available diversity in the world? And I would say probably not. And finally, here is a slide that I think is the implications of which are quite frightening. And that is that this looks at the number of species and the largest collections in the world for those species. And the tall bar on the left represents the number of species for which the biggest collection in the world falls between 1 and 10 samples. Not really the biological foundation you would expect for a great breeding program. We found when we surveyed a lot of gene banks when I was at the Global Crop Diversity Trust that basically gene banks were not providing material to breeders. Many of the collections were unused internationally. And much of that was for political reasons. There were political barriers. But in addition, there are probably half of the crops that have been grown and traded in world commerce historically have no breeders whatsoever and have never had any plant breeders. And there's a cruel sort of political arithmetic that goes along with this that I've found in my international work. It's sort of a zero-sum kind of game. Imagine your gene bank gives 10 samples to a foreign gene bank, and that foreign gene bank gives 8 back to you. Almost everybody in this room will have just now done some arithmetic. And the question is, the arithmetic that you did in your head, was it subtraction or was it addition? Most of the countries in the world are doing subtraction. They'll say, well, we gave them 10, we got 8 back, we're down 2. The way to look at this is, no, you're not down 2 because you still have your 10, you're up 8. You're ahead of the game by 8. But this is not the politics of today, and this is not what's happening out there. So I began to ask myself, what is it that gene banks are actually doing? If they're poorly conserving this diversity, and if they're not making it available, and if it's not connected with breeding programs, you know, what is actually happening? And that sort of makes me ask another question is, well, what should they be doing? If they're not doing that, which is sort of the 1970s model of agricultural development, what could we learn from the past? What could we learn from the American experience? And this leads me to ask the question why we couldn't or why we shouldn't be distributing this diversity that we have in gene banks. We have the possibility, distributed in particular, to small subsistence farmers, particularly for crops for which there are no breeding programs. There are about 1.4 billion people on Earth that live in farm families that are largely self-provisioning in terms of seeds. They're not a market for commercial seed companies. They're not a market for the public seed service. How are they going to adapt their crops to climate change if they don't have access to diversity and there are no plant breeders working for their crops? So it strikes me that we're fairly well positioned to model the diversity, to research the diversity we have, to model the climate that's coming, to assemble packets of seeds, which might be a combination of old farmer varieties and modern improved varieties, and to enlist farmers again in a mass adaptation experiment. I know that's a wild and crazy idea, but I haven't heard any alternatives to it. I won't get into the obvious institutional impediments to do something like that, but I will say that I think we're better positioned to assemble and distribute germplasm and to have farmers experiment with it than the United States was in 1800 when the United States looked like this. The counterfactual, of course, is that are we ready really to assume that crops are going to adapt by themselves without diversity or without plant breeders? If we are assuming that we're going to have development without diversity, now that would really be an historically unprecedented experiment. To go back to the gene banks again, the final problem that we experienced with gene banks was that they simply weren't secure. Forget the budget, forget the equipment failures, forget all of that. They physically were not secure. Here's a picture of my friend Nestor from the Philippine Gene Bank, and he's pointing to a place on the wall where the water got up to during a typhoon in the Philippines. The next day after the water had receded, this was what the gene bank looked like, and you can see that certainly that sample of maize on the floor is gone. So there was an extinction event that day. And after they got everything cleaned up and they secured the gene bank again, then it burned down, at least part of it. So this was the type of thing that happens in gene banks. Now, you could say, and there are a lot of policymakers that would say, well, who cares? Why do we care what happens to that Philippine gene bank? Because we do have a great gene bank in Fort Collins, Colorado. And the answer to that question is this, and you don't really have to study this chart, you just have to look at the numbers for a second. The numbers are what percentage of the global collection does each of these countries on the left have for those particular crops? And I got posed this question in Australia a couple of years ago when an Australian said, well, who cares what happens to these other gene banks? We've got a good collection of wheat here. And I said, yeah, you've got 3% of the global total. And if in the current situation, if in the context of climate change, you're happy with the 3% and you don't need access to the other 97, then be my guest, be happy. But you might have occasion to use the other 97%. So the question of who cares is that we should all care. Collectively, individually, all of our collections in the world are small. Collectively, they're not. But at the country level, we're all dependent or interdependent. And at the variety level, when you consider plant breeders creating a new variety and you see the pedigree of those crop varieties, you see that material has come from all over the world to create a particular variety. So in other words, what happens in the Philippines really does concern us. And that leads to my tour that I'm going to give you of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, because some years back, the head of the gene bank in the United States in Fort Collins and I were talking about things. And we had just gone through a process with a bunch of international agricultural research centers in which we had helped to upgrade their facilities. We had a big grant from the World Bank to do that. And we were sitting around, in a sense, fat, dumb, and happy, thinking that we had upgraded these gene banks and everything was great, but they were in a bunch of countries that were not necessarily safe, or always safe, one of them being Syria. Colombia, Peru, Kenya, all of these have had their share of troubles in the past. So we thought, well, we really need, this is an incredibly valuable resource, and we had experienced, as Americans, we had experienced two things in our recent history. We had experienced 9/11, and we had experienced Hurricane Katrina. 9/11 taught us essentially that no place is completely safe, and Hurricane Katrina was even, in a sense, more interesting because you remember after Hurricane Katrina, people said, well, they, speaking about the experts or people in charge or whoever they is, they knew that one day a Force 5 hurricane would hit New Orleans, and they knew that if it did, the levees would break, and they knew if the levees broke, New Orleans would be flooded and be a disaster. And here we were in the field of crop diversity, and we were Genebank people, and yep, we knew that someday something really bad would happen to a Genebank, and the they would be us if we hadn't done anything about it. So we approached the Norwegian government, and we asked them if they might consider building a safety deposit vault, essentially near the North Pole. This arrow shows the location we were proposing. That's at 78 degrees north. To give you a sense of how far north that is, that's northern Norway that you see down below it. So it's separate from northern Norway. And if you're sort of dipping your toes into the Mediterranean on the shores of Africa, and you fly up to Oslo, you're a little bit more than halfway there. So this is very far north. It's a remarkably beautiful place, just otherworldly. I'll just show you a few slides of it very quickly. That's a glacier. Side of the glacier is probably about 300 feet tall, to give you a sense of scale. There are animals up there. The most numerous are reindeer. I think there are about 15,000 of them. We do have polar bears, and this sign in Norwegian tells you they can be anywhere, anytime, so watch out. They're typically not friendly. There is a small Norwegian settlement there, about 2,000 people. Incredible infrastructure, but quite small. And this is the proposed facility that we wanted to build. And the reason that we went to Svalbard, that far north, was several reasons. One is it's remote, but it's accessible. And the remoteness gave us safety from a lot of human dangers in the world, but it was accessible. We could get seed in and out. It was also cold. And if you want to conserve seed for a long time, you freeze them, basically. So we wanted not to totally depend on mechanical freezing equipment. We wanted it to supplement the natural cold. So we conceived that this facility would be built inside of a mountain in the permafrost, and we wanted to find the coldest part of the mountain, and the coldest part of the mountain in this case is about -5 Celsius. The ideal temperature for conserving this material is about -18 Celsius. So we only had 13 degrees to go, which is a lot better than if you were doing it here. So this was the idea. This was the design that we came up with, the architects. And this shows the facility under construction. So I want to give you an idea of the scale of it. Not huge. It was quite a construction job, however. And this shows the facility in situ, in its natural environment, if you will. We coordinate seed shipments from around the world to arrive on a particular day a couple of times a year. And we put these boxes of seeds down in the vault. When you enter that front door, you're looking down a long tunnel. This is not some antiseptic laboratory situation. It's very practical, very low cost. Norway built this facility, paid for it completely itself, cost $9 million. And you get to this wonderfully beautiful room, I think, down at the end of the mountain, and the seeds are actually going to be located in that door that you see there to the left. It's cold inside, as you can see. And when you go through that door, you're in one of 3 rooms that we have for storing seed. Now, the management plan here is that it works just like a safety deposit box in the bank. Norway owns the facility. Countries or institutions create a copy of their seeds, essentially. They send them up in packets inside boxes. We don't open the boxes. We don't open the packets. We sign an agreement with them in the front end that will specify that we don't claim any physical or intellectual property rights over the material. That was to get us around a lot of obvious legal and political issues. We store it free of charge. And today we have samples, each sample being about 500 seeds of 864,000 different crop varieties or populations. So it is by far the largest collection of domesticated or agricultural biodiversity in the world. The great thing about this facility is that we haven't lost any seed samples. We've been operating for 7 years, and essentially we've put an end. I know this is a bold statement, but so far it's true. I think we've put an end to the extinction, at least of all the crop diversity that's in this facility. And that's saying something, I think, and particularly in a climate changing era. When I look at the seed vault and I reflect on what's happened, I think that this is one of the few things that I can say that has happened in the world in the last, well, in my lifetime, that's both positive and long-term and involves virtually every country in the world. In that sense, one could hope that it's something of a model. It is, however, just one step forward. It's not a solution to the problem of crop adaptation to climate change, which I think is the biggest challenge agriculture has ever faced. It doesn't mean that we as a society are getting serious about adapting agriculture to climate change. One possibly could make the argument that we have a lot of resources invested with a few crops, with rice, maize, and wheat. But what about all of the other crops? And how well prepared are we with those to deal with the challenges of climate change? Crops like this, which is a crop that I'm working with on my farm called lathyrus or grass pea. In my life, it occurs to me that one thing we can see is that, people are very future-oriented, they're project-oriented, they're goal-oriented. They make good plans, and human beings are pretty good about implementation of those plans. Where we typically go wrong is in making faulty assumptions about our plans. And when I look at agriculture today and I look at what's happening with our climate, whether you want to call it climate change or even if you just want to call it bad weather, it seems like we're not acting as if next month is going to be the 362nd consecutive month of above average temperatures. We're more or less acting like we're going to go back to square one and we're going to have the previous normal temperature. We're sort of assuming and acting as if crops are going to adapt by themselves simply because we want so badly and need so badly for them to adapt. And we're assuming that all but a handful of crops are unimportant, that there's really no need for the collections and the breeding, farmer experimentation, if you will, for crops such as lathyrus. But adaptation of our domesticated crops is in our hands because they are domesticated. One of the leading figures in my field, Serrato Frankel, said about domesticated crops that we have inherited evolutionary responsibility for them. A central question for our time is how we're discharging that responsibility. And I'll end with this wonderful quote from Charles Darwin that applies both to our crops and to ourselves. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Thanks so much.
Okay, there we go. Hi everyone, I'm David Lobel. I'm the deputy here in Center on Food Security and Environment to Roz, and I have the pleasure of moderating the Q&A here and also asking some of the first questions for Carrie. So, I've known you for a while, and I've actually had the pleasure of going to the Svalbard Sea Vault, which was really inspiring. I mean, to see, as you said, it's a major step forward, but just a step. And as you described, it's basically like a safety deposit box where you have access to these, but nobody else has access. So it solves the physical security challenge. But the other big challenge you mentioned was sort of the cooperation challenge. And I wonder if you could just talk about what kind of progress, if any, has been made on that front. And is there progress? I know that there were some treaties in discussion. There were, for particular crops, there's progress, and for other ones, there's less. So where do you see that heading in the next few years?
Yeah. Well, we do have an international treaty on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and that treaty obliges countries that are party to the treaty, and there are some 130 or 40 countries that are, to provide what the treaty calls facilitated access to a fairly long list of important crops. But the treaty is a little bit like the stop sign at the end of the road. You can set up rules and regulations, but that doesn't mean that everybody's abiding by them. So there have been some studies recently testing out how well countries are abiding by that treaty, and the study revealed that it was an academic who wrote to different countries requesting, under the terms of the treaty, this genetic material. 44 countries complied and 77 didn't. So we have a long way to go in terms of building trust. And I think a lot of this, David, gets back to the mentality, I would say, frankly, of around the Convention on Biological Diversity, where people, countries, policymakers, started to think that they were sitting on these genetic gold mines, that this biodiversity was not just important, but it was economically valuable, even if there wasn't a market. And countries began to hoard and not to share. And I think that if we look forward, particularly in a era of climate change, we have to realize that the collections of crop diversity that a particular country might have, in part because of climate change, may not be the collections of traits that they are going to need. Why? Because their climate is changing. So it might be the collections of some far distant country that become very important. And this ought to teach us what I think is the scientifically and historically accurate way of describing this diversity, that it's the common heritage of mankind that ought to be treated as the common heritage of mankind, and that the benefit of this diversity comes mostly from sharing it, not from hoarding it.
Right, and the other aspect I'd imagine is that a lot of the breeding and a lot of crop development is done by international groups, whether they're private corporations now or public entities like the CG system. Do they get stymied by these national sort of protectionism of the genetic resource, or are they a way of kind of facilitating that exchange?
I think they're in better shape than most. It's easier for an international center to go and collect somewhere and conserve than it is for the United States, for example. But they are stymied as well, for sure. Yeah. And looking at Genebanks, this is a dubious record of achievement, but I think I visited probably more gene banks than any human. But I've only visited one in my whole life, where I used to perform a little trick when I went to the gene banks. I would say, oh, well, how many crops are you conserving here in your gene bank? And they would give a number. And then about 30 minutes later, I would say, oh, by the way, how many crops do you have plant breeding programs for in this country? And I'd see how closely they matched up. You know, are we just saving for the hell of saving, or conserving, or are we actually making use of the material? Because if we're not making use of it, I've always thought, you know, somebody from the finance ministry is going to come along in one of these tropical countries and saying, why is this big electric bill for these freezers if you're not doing anything with it? And there's only one country where, when I asked that second question, they got it instantly, and they said, well, and they gave me exactly the same number as they were conserving, because they said, well, why would we conserve if we're not going to actually use this diversity? But there's only one.
Yeah. Okay. Which one is what people want to know?
Which one is Cuba? And I think probably because the political situation there was such that the scientists in that gene bank had never visited other gene banks. They were blissfully unaware.
Okay, some benefits of isolation.
Yes.
We have plenty of time to open up. I'm just going to delve into one other area, which I know we'll get into more, or if experience is any guide, we'll get into more, which is GMOs. Yeah. And I'm just, so I have a few sets of questions. One would be, are there any stipulations with this agreement with Norway? I mean, Norway's been incredibly generous with this, but they have also sort of, I would say, in the group of countries that have pretty strong opinions about GMOs. Was there any restrictions on what can go in or out, or is it really, it's a black box that goes in and anything can be in there? Is that?
Well,
I'm sure you've gotten the question, are there GMOs in your bank?
yeah, there's a short and a long answer to that. The short answer is no. No, we don't have GMOs in the seed vault.
But you wouldn't necessarily know.
Well, we sign agreements with depositors, and part of the agreement is that there are no GMOs. And the reason is that Norway is very hostile to GMOs. Yeah. And the existing regulations, unless they were going to pass another law specifically for the seed vault, the existing regulations would not allow the importation of GMOs for storage in that particular facility. There's sort of a positive and a negative to this. Our job with the seed vault is to conserve diversity. Our job is not to make value judgments about which diversity is worth conserving and which is not. If we were in that business, we'd have to be a lot more omniscient than I feel like we are. And we'd have to really know what agriculture was going to need 100 or 500 years from now. Many of the seeds, by the way, in the seed vault can last for thousands of years. So we don't get in that business. And so one could say, well, you know, then you've restricted the kind of biodiversity you can put in there. But really, if you look at the GMOs today, there's very little diversity in those GMOs that we don't have from traditional varieties. So I feel like from a diversity standpoint, we haven't lost anything. Now, a lot of people will take that answer of, no, we don't have any in there, and I've had this experience before when somebody says, oh, well, thank God. And I'm not in the business of giving everybody the answer they necessarily want to hear. And
you used to be, but now you're not.
I used to be, but
yeah.
I work for the UN, but
That's
you know.
Right.
But I have to say, well, gosh, we're at 78 degrees north. We're at minus 18. The seeds are inside of a sealed package, inside of a sealed box, behind about 7 locked doors. There's no agriculture on those islands. Nothing could happen if, so what's the worst that could happen if there were GMOs in there? But the reality is they're not.
The other question, just along those lines, is you've you've had a lot of unique experiences, but one I think is you've delved a lot into policy, both on the climate change side and on the sort of genetic resources side. And you've worked also a lot in Europe and a lot in other countries, including the US. Where do you see the biggest mismatch between sort of what you know as a consumer of the latest science and what the public is discussing or what the policymakers are discussing? Is it on the climate change side? Is it on the GMO side? Is it depend on where you are in the world?
Well, the latest studies indicate that it's on the GMO side. I mean, that's just the academic studies. But one of the things that disturbs me is that agriculture is really not part of the discussion about climate change. And there are reasons for that. The discussion about climate change globally is at the political level, at the government level, is being driven primarily by foreign ministries and by ministries of environment. And particularly ministries of environment, in my experience, are not agriculture's best friend. In many governments around the world, those are antagonistic ministries. And my experience is it's difficult to talk to governments when they're being led by environment ministries about the needs of agriculture, because they see agriculture as sort of anti-environment in many ways. So it's very difficult. You know, my argument is that if agriculture doesn't adapt, neither are we. And all bets are off in terms of mitigation and other adaptation measures if we don't deal with this, of what's on the front lines of climate change, which are the crops in the field. So my obsession these days is to try to talk to policymakers and make them aware that the assumption that agriculture is okay, the assumption that crops somehow magically or quickly adapt to very different conditions, this is a very dangerous assumption to be making. And you know that from your work, I think.
Okay, I have plenty more, but let's open it up now to mix it up a little bit here. Go ahead in the front.
So is the
Oh, sorry. Let me just ask people to wait for a microphone. They'll be coming around quickly. You could maybe state your name.
just a technical issue on the design of the structure. Is the corrugated steel liner the only part of the near surface hole which is subject to freeze thaw, and everything beyond that is permafrost? And do you expect that to remain the case as the Arctic warms?
The corrugated structure goes beyond that freeze thaw area because we expect it to warm in that area to become larger or longer into the tunnel. We have done a lot of modeling about the temperature, and we have sensors at different points in the mountain, so we know the temperature inside the rock, quite far inside the rock, and that also told us, by the way, how quickly the facility froze down when we took it from -5 to -18. Essentially, we've frozen the entire or large part of the mountain around those rooms, and so we therefore know how long it's going to take to warm up to the -5 if we were to have failure of the equipment. But we could have you talk about the Maytag repairman, those old TV commercials. We could go for some years without having the Maytag repairman go up there to repair those things. And we know that even in that situation, most of our seeds would be fine for decades at -5. So I can't say that we didn't think of everything, but that we did think of everything. But we checked the radiation levels inside the mountain beforehand. We calculated. I mean, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but we did calculate where the sea level would rise to in Svalbard if all the ice in the world melted, and we had the world's largest recorded tsunami. and the seed vault is 5 stories above that.
There won't be any people left to breathe.
No,
That's
we
fine.
won't have. That will not be our big worry at that point.
There were similar questions, I know. Go ahead, Chair Wally.
Gary, thanks for that marvelous talk. You started off by telling us about the American experience of distributing seeds and in a way what a success that led to. Suppose I were a developing country in Africa and said, I'd like to try that experiment these days. What would you tell that country as to whether it was a good idea, how they would do it, where they would get the seeds from, what about the diseases and pests that you might bring along with the new seeds that come in? Could you, I'm intrigued by the idea, and I wonder if it is practically relevant for countries today.
Well, I think there are 1,000 complications, and you mentioned a couple. In the long term, I don't think those complications outweigh the complication of adapting to agriculture without diversity. Practically speaking, I would say, well, you've got a gene bank, and you probably have a couple of good people in that gene bank, but your gene bank is trying to do, it's set up to do things that it's not actually doing. It perhaps is not actually providing long-term conservation. It's not actually providing material to plant breeders. So one thing you could consider doing would be to transform that gene bank into being essentially, this seems like a derogatory term, but a middleman that would be a middleman between the farmers and agricultural organizations in the country that would assess what those needs are now. And the larger gene banks in the international system that you know well, in the United States and others, try to enlist people that would help to model the climate and put together this seed that could be distributed in a variety of ways. My sense is that if it were done properly, it would be done sort of on a Hippocratic oath principle of, sort of first do no harm. That you would distribute seeds in small quantities for experimental purposes. And yeah, I think we go from there. That's sort of the way I've thought through it.
You could control for pests and pathogens enough to have your Hippocratic oath come.
Well, not completely. You could control to some extent, for sure. But be aware that there's a huge amount of germplasm flowing in the world today. And I'm not sure how well that's controlled. Gene banks big ones are releasing a lot of material. There are a lot of seeds and plant materials being spread in the world today. And I don't say that this is without problem or complication. But again, I really have trouble understanding, and I must admit, I'm sort of focused on subsistence farmers that are outside of normal seed supply systems. And if the climates in Africa, as you and where's Marshall and others have said, are going to be novel over a large portion of land area by the middle of the century, and we're going to have different assemblages of species already. We're going to have new pests and diseases, not coming in on the seed, but coming in the air and on the ground. How are those crops for which there are no seed supply systems and no plant breeders, what's going to happen with those crops and the people that really depend on them more than most of us would realize? And that scares me. We don't have many researchers and we don't have many models about what's going to happen with those crops. And to think, and I don't see any alternative, Wally. That's one of the reasons I wanted to present it to this crowd. I want somebody like you or others to say, well, that's a crazy idea, or there are complications to that, or it's not going to work for this, that, or the other reason. But what I don't hear when I throw out this idea is people saying, well, no, actually, there's an alternative to that. The way we're going to deal with African leafy vegetables or other smaller crops for which there are no breeders, the yams, 6 breeders in the world for yams. The way we're going to deal with that is, point 1, point 2, point 3, but I don't see anyone discussing that. And so I'm basically trying to get that discussion started for a wide range of crops, some of which, are crops that are not in our head in terms of the names, but some of which are major crops like yams.
But certainly when you say there are no alternatives, I mean, one alternative would be to take the situation and make it where there's more than 6 breeders for these crops.
Absolutely. I mean,
these are more mainstream.
yes, that would be, I'd love that.
Okay.
I don't see that happening.
Okay, why don't we go, he's been waiting, then back to her, and then up front, and then there was over here.
Just a brief remark on that previous question, and then my own question. I think it would be interesting to hear you engage with some invasion biologists on that question, because I think there are some number of those biologists who would dig their heels in with some strenuous reservations. So my own question concerns an assumption that you appear to make that seeds that evolved in a climate that we no longer have could be helpful in a completely novel set of climates in the future. So if you grant that every climate everywhere is going to be different from anything during the time in which the seeds evolved, it's no longer clear that we could be confident that these seeds will be helpful in producing food that people need. And I wondered whether that question has been seriously addressed, and if it has an answer, if you have it.
I'm not quite sure if I understand what you're saying, but I think that the collections that we have in Genebanks are properly should be considered as a genetic resource, not thought of so much as varieties which could be taken out and used or would have value as is, but are a collection of traits. So it might be that few of those populations, samples, varieties, whatever we want to call them, will be useful in the future in dramatically new conditions. But as collections, they contain the sum total of the traits that we have at our disposal for the future, and that is where I think the value is.
Right, but
Yeah,
Maybe I missed
I
it.
think the other,
yeah, I think
the
you've
point of,
missed the crux of the question.
yeah, let me just
Yeah,
say that
sorry.
the novelty is referring kind of locally. So if Kenya gets a novel climate, it's meaning that the climate that farmers in Kenya are experiencing is climate that they have never experienced. It doesn't mean that there's not a place in the world like in India that may have varieties and traits that are useful for those farmers. It's
Well, except the description of the sorts of changes that you began your great lecture with could lead one to believe that no place on Earth will resemble any place anywhere in the
that's not true.
past
Yeah.
because of the the length of the hot season, the extreme temperatures that have never been before encountered, and so on. So there are a variety of factors that you cited at the beginning of your talk, which might lead one to believe that there have been no traits in the historical development of traits that could deal with these novel conditions. And this leads to the question of how we can be confident that this collection of seeds would really be useful in a future that has these completely new conditions to deal with.
Well, no, I mean, I assume that our collections contain valuable, useful traits, and otherwise I wouldn't be interested in, conserving them. But certainly, there could be a case, I don't know what you think about it, David, but where there are new unique combinations of conditions that haven't perhaps existed anywhere. But on a sort of condition by condition basis, the climate, this particular pest, this particular disease, this soil condition, you would be able to find examples
I think
of
another
that.
way of looking at this is experiments that take extreme conditions, say like 45 degrees Celsius, and expose a crop to it. Any of those studies that have been done across a range of varieties inevitably find huge genetic variation in their ability to deal with that. So there's clearly genetic variation out there. You would think it would be the ones that evolved in hotter climates are the ones that withstand it, and that's sometimes the case. Sometimes it's just genes that have been hanging around in areas. Why don't we go back there to the lady that was waiting?
Yes, I am wondering if you save the DNA of information of the seeds somewhere.
Well, there's pretty wide variability in how Genebanks deal with that. I should have mentioned, you're perhaps referring to the seed vault in Norway. That the database, we do maintain a database of what's in there, but that database is really pretty minimal in terms of, we're really interested in the inventory of what we have. But it links back to the databases of the depositing institution. So it's really the job, the responsibility of a depositing institution such as the U.S. facility to do its research and to maintain its database, and there's wide variation in what those institutions do. I mean, for some collections and samples, there's a lot of information. For others, frankly, we don't even know where it was collected.
Just to have a question up here. I'll go back.
Are there?
There you go.
Are you aware of parallel efforts to Svalbard to preserve the global diversity of germplasm in crops that are either primarily vegetatively propagated or are unorthodox seeds that don't really lend themselves to traditional seed banking?
Mm-hmm. There's nothing quite like Svalbard for those crops. And it'd be sort of hard to imagine there being, but there's certainly collections of those crops. So, for instance, we don't have banana germplasm in Svalbard, or coconuts, or some of the berries. That diversity is not conserved that way. Some of the tuber crops we're missing, but the Global Crop Diversity Trust, where I was working, did have arrangements with Genebanks for those crops. So we were supporting global banana collection in Belgium, for example, for some of the other crops that I just mentioned. But there are duplicate copies of those in other institutions around the world, but nothing quite like Svalbard. It would be difficult. We actually, for a moment, considered it in Svalbard, but when you need liquid nitrogen, or you need a laboratory for tissue culture or things like that, then going near the North Pole to do that's really not very practical.
Question back there.
I was wondering if you have, here in the U.S., there's enormous agriculture business that uses majority of our land. Are they in discussion with diversifying their fields at all? Are they open to it? Are they resistant to it?
Well, I think there's sort of at least two ways of looking at the diversity issue on the ground, and one is sort of diversity in time, and the other is diversity in place. We tend to look at fields in developing countries, particularly amongst subsistence farmers, and we see a lot of diversity in the field. The example I showed you today of the 7 spikes of wheat that were really came out of one farmer's field, so you can see that. And that's a huge, that's a lot of, well, at least visually, there's a lot of diversity. But in modern systems, highly commercial systems like we have in the United States, you have a fairly rapid turnover of varieties, and so you may have a lot of genetic uniformity in the field one year, but it's not the same uniformity you're going to have next year because of the breeding programs and the turnover. There have been efforts, and I think there's a fair amount of discussion and even a fair amount of concern amongst some public and some private plant breeding efforts about broadening the base of their breeding work. So there is a bit of that going on. How much, I'm really not in a position to know.
Take maybe 2 more questions back there and then up here.
Okay, just a quick observation. So you've said that you're not in the business of deciding what counts as diversity. And I guess I come from the humanities, so I'm really interested in stories and metaphor. So the story that we tell of the distribution of American diversity is also, right, the story of genocide. It's also the story of settler colonialism. It's the story of the loss of a particular kind of diversity. So, so that's just one observation. And I wonder, and when I think of banks do a good job of holding property, right? But they don't do a good job of sharing property. So the library strikes me as another kind of institutional, a metaphor of an institution that circulates information and circulates the commons. So I wonder what you think of seed libraries as a institution to be exploited by the people rather than banks, which are maintained by experts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't have anything against experts. Most of the diversity we have in the seed banks around the world is diversity that's in the public domain. So in a sense, if it's operating properly, and I already volunteered and acknowledged the fact that a lot of them aren't, but if they're operating properly, the government seed banks do function as a library. We have no restrictions in the United States on who can access material. You have to be a bona fide user and such, but any researcher, it's not a commercial venture, it's not about politics. People can go in and that material can be accessed. I was just at day before yesterday, at a meeting in Tucson, Arizona, just by accident, of people from public libraries who are starting seed libraries. So I was talking with a lot of those people, and I guess my response, I don't want to avoid your question, but in a way I do, because the answer is very long about how I see that movement, unfolding.
So there do exist some examples of that, but they're not widespread.
Yeah.
There's a microphone coming right here.
Great talk. I very much like your idea of the middleman between what you're doing and where we are today. And it made me think immediately of another middleman between the middleman and where we are now, who would be thinking about at least some of the things that you're doing and the, let's say, various kinds of Armageddons that we are facing in the near future, which you outlined at the beginning of your talk. I wonder if you could just simply comment on that issue, how to energize the various people who are at least attempting to make policy now and maybe dealing with the agricultural industry and other stuff like that that's not doing very well by us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure what to say other than, as I was talking with some of my friends earlier and over lunch, I have been spending a bit of time in, excuse me, in Washington and talking with some policymakers, elected representatives, and we're in a difficult situation in this country because we haven't learned how to talk civilly about large issues. And you know, climate is one of them. And at least in terms of agriculture and climate, I think there's an opportunity. And the opportunity is that one person can talk about climate, another person can talk about bad weather, if they don't. And in terms of what we need to be doing in terms of agriculture, our response is it doesn't make much difference. It's pretty much the same. I mean, I'm a strong advocate of not cutting the budget for our national seed bank, for having more public sector plant breeding, including of crops for which there are no plant breeders at this point, things like that. Now, in my mind, I could say, well, that's because I want those crops to be adapted to climate change. But somebody else might say, well, I just want them to be adapted to this bad weather we've been having in abundance recently, or the next pest or disease outbreak. It doesn't really matter in the end, as long as we can get together and do something that has an incredibly high cost-benefit ratio.
Is there a group of people or an organization who are actually doing this? I mean, what you're saying, I hope, is what I was talking about, which is that educating those who are firm in their belief that they don't believe in this, educating them. If you've been to Washington, presumably be talking to somebody who's got something to do with whatever it is that's going to happen next time around, and that is really what I'm talking about a middleman who's halfway between you and the middleman you were talking about and where we are today. It's what's happening right today. Is there a group of people who really are interested in talking civilly about some of these problems, which, again, you just outlined here, but which, in my biased opinion, are all together. They're all tied together, the heat and the oceans and the sliding glaciers and stuff like that. It's all glued into the same thing. Are there such people?
I don't know of any organizations that are taking that sort of tack. And that is a big problem. When I go out and give lectures to the general public, I do very often start out by saying, look, I believe in climate change, and I think the data is overwhelming. But we need to talk about this civilly, and I want to try to do that in a way that doesn't disrespect you, make you feel disrespected. I might think you're wrong, but that doesn't mean that I have to carry it to the next step and get emotional about those kind of things. Not in public, because we need to have a dialogue about this. And we in this country, we really need to have a dialogue about this. And if we can't figure out how to do that, every day that we don't figure out how to do that is a day lost that we could be using for doing something positive. So for me, I like to quote this John Hume, who won a Nobel Peace Prize years ago, issue of Ireland. He said that victories and solutions are not the same thing. And when you look at our government and the dysfunction of it, I think what you really see is almost everyone going for victory. And I can't imagine how either side is going to achieve victory. So I really have to wonder why we don't have more people that say, well, victory is not working so well for me. So why don't we go for solution? And if we wanted to have a place to start the discussion about climate, I would think it would be about agriculture, because we all need it. The crops are on the front lines. And we could do it in a non-threatening way, because you can talk about bad weather and I can talk about climate, or we can invent a new word and move forward.
All right, that seems like a great place to end, and we're also out of time. So let me remind you, there's a reception just back here where you can find Carrie. And please join me in thanking him again for a great lecture.
Thanks, Dave.